But welcome and hello everyone. My name is Juliette de Meyer. I'm a professor at the University of Montreal and I'm the co-organizer of the Paperology Reading and Activity Group with my colleagues Alexandra Kaminska, Alice Koshinsky and Ghislain Thibault. The Paperology Reading and Activity Group started in September 2020. It gathers an interdisciplinary and international group of scholars and artists. And the objective for this group is to engage with emerging research and the growing literature on paper as a material. So our goal is to better understand the material histories, the forms, the practices, and the possibilities of paper. And so to do that, we meet monthly to discuss readings. And we also have public activities such as this one today. So we are glad to see so many of you join us for this talk. Please consider also joining us for our next two events this semester. We have two events. So we'll have a conversation with Montreal paper makers Sophie Pévoyer and Maya C. Donnelly on February 8th. And we'll also have something in March. It's a peep box making workshop led by Christina Corfield on March 11. And you can find information about these events and about the Paperology Reading and Activity Group in general on our website. We will publish the link to our website in the chat feature of Zoom in a minute. So a little bit of housekeeping, maybe. We are recording this talk. Let me check that the recording is, yes, the recording is working. So please be aware that we are recording it. Please turn off your microphone during the presentation. You're welcome to use the chat feature and to use the microphone during the question period at the end. Of course, we will have time for questions at the end. So now it's a pleasure to introduce Elana Herzog, our speaker today. Elana Herzog is an artist who lives and works in New York City. She was the object of many solo and group exhibitions in New York City, but also elsewhere in the United States and also in Europe. She was a 2017 Guggenheim Fellow, and in 2008, she was awarded a residency at the Dieu Donné Papermill in New York City, which she will talk about it today. And she has continued to work with handmade paper pulp ever since. Her current focus is on the global migrations of culture and technology. And in addition to paper, she often uses textile in her sculptural work. She's going to show us some things about that too, I think. And you can go check her website if you want to know more about her playful work with carpets, for example. Elana's work often blurs the distinction between support and gesture. She accepted to revisit her work along the lines of the experiential conditions of paper and around the broad themes of paper as support, substrates, and medium. So Elana, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. If I can. And okay. Cool. Did I do that right? Okay. Hi, everybody. I wanted to thank the Paperology Reading Group and its organizers for this really lovely opportunity, and just for having put together this great program, which I'm enjoying so thoroughly. And, you know, it's really exposing me to ideas that were not familiar at all. In connection with this current upcoming meeting that we'll be having, where surface and substrate are the subject, I thought, you know, this would be a kind of a good time, or everybody seemed to think that this was a good time for me to introduce some work, because that has been a really important part of my work overall, as sort of a conversation about that relationship. I make work whose structural integrity sort of appears to be in question and often precarious. and where the hierarchical relationships between surface and substrate, or what you could call like surface and armature, figure and ground, are ambiguous and called into question. So I'm going to start by showing a few of my pieces, and interestingly at this point, you know, I'm sort of choosing by decade. I'm looking at things in terms of decades instead of years. So I started using fabric in a lot of my work in the late 80s and in the 90s, sort of focused primarily on it. I initially was interested in it for its kind of psychologically evocative potential. And here in two pieces from the mid-90s, I've used fitted sheets to construct amorphous forms. And that's a lot what I like about the fitted sheet, is that it is so amorphous. And on the left is one that kind of pushes toward the decorative, two fitted sheets, different colors with, you know, colored glass beads. And I call this an homage to Lee Bonnecue, who is, you know, a mid-20th century female sculptor. And the one on the right is more abject, I would say, and more medical in its implication, and features this sort of awkward amorphous form of the fitted sheet, you know, very explicitly. And that, in my mind, I associate with the moment in which, you know, we were gripped most by the AIDS epidemic, and where the medical world and the intimate world sort of collided really in the culture, and where plastic and barriers, you know, it's kind of in a way eerily reminiscent of what's going on today, I would say, with our fear of disease and its mysteries. So anyway, you can kind of see manipulations of materials that are familiar, but on the other hand, have been defamiliarized. I grew up in the 60s and 70s on a kind of a heavy diet of what I would call late modernism, structured, and I do have some notes here that I'm reading from because I admit I'm a little nervous today. Structured around the idea of linear progress, you know, in which isms, one ism led to the next, with a kind of historical, implied historical inevitability. And I feel that this kind of thinking is ultimately based in hierarchies that I experienced as a young artist as very punitive and limiting, privileging abstract form and thought above all other things. So my response to this sort of repressive system, or what I experienced as a repressive system, has been to define myself sort of playfully and urgently by making things that really attempt to undermine those hierarchies, or at least draw attention to them and call them into question. So I have always used these materials that are pedestrian and are rooted in the everyday. So after showing you these, I will move on to, and why can't I move on? That's not good. Oh, yeah, okay. Now we can go. To the mid-90s, again, a more abject piece that lies on the floor and is attached to the wall with a kind of stapled drawing. In the early 2000s, I moved into making a body of work that referenced painting more explicitly, and in which I attached bedspreads primarily, so large scale pieces of textile to walls and other surfaces, and then stapled along their patterns in order to produce a drawing that consisted of the fabric residue, the staple residue, and the the metal of the staple itself, and included the wall in it. So, it was kind of a further effort to dematerialize the art object so that it didn't fit into a clear category. It wasn't autonomous. It's structurally dependent on its surroundings. There are a lot of other things you can talk about in here, but that is one of them that is important. And I did, throughout the 2000s, like a really big body of work along these lines. And you can see details here, and you can see the way the light sort of reflects. So they change a lot depending on how they're lit. They sort of take on a chiaroscuro quality when they're dark, when the staple is in darkness, and this reflective, glittering, decorative quality when it's in light. And jumping ahead 20 years, here are a couple of pieces made in the last year. Here also with staples, a further effort to kind of dissolve and deconstruct the surface and melt it into the substrate. And then another piece that is actually currently being exhibited in a gallery in Brooklyn called Cat House Proper, in which there's no stapling, and the structural sort of ambiguity or dependencies are kind of articulated more through this relationship to wall and ceiling that supports the piece. One of the things that has really attracted me, I think initially and even now, to using loose fabric is also the fact that it doesn't have a real fixed compositional structure that's absolute. It shifts the act of the artist away from being the person who determines the exact location of a mark into a place where there are other forces kind of controlling that, and therefore other decisions, other artistic decisions and types of decisions that are generating the relationships between the elements. You can see detail here of the way that these pieces of fabric, which I've collected in different countries over various trips, are being kind of fused together through this embroidery process. So the embroidery becomes structural in the same way that the staples were structural in some of the early piece, rather than being just decorative. So having said that, I will go on to say a few words about Dieu Donné itself, the paper mill, where I was lucky enough to be offered a residency in 2008. Dieu Donné has existed in several locations in Manhattan and is now in Brooklyn. It's a paper mill devoted to supporting artists who want to work with handmade paper. And it provides a lot of technical expertise and physical support and materials and resources. It's a very kind of process-intensive medium and requires a lot of equipment that individuals can't usually afford to sustain. So it's an artisanal practice and really best done in an institutional situation. So Dieu Donné has several master paper makers in its history. And these pictures, for one thing, are not my own pictures. I pull them off the internet, just so you all understand, from a search of Dieu Donné. This is a beater, it's called. And in it, it's full of white, what I assume is cotton pulp. It can give you the impression, rightly, that paper making is a very wet medium. You spend your time wearing an apron. You can see here a drain in the floor. I don't know. Oh yeah, you probably can't see the right because there are pictures there. You see a giant vat that could hold, gallons and gallons of pulp. People who are making paper wear boots. I guess some of these are on the right side of my screen, so I'm not seeing them. People wear boots, they wear rubber aprons. There are hoses. I'm using my cursor to show you some of these things everywhere. And I can't, oh, there we go. Okay. So in the beater, pulp is beaten to a pulp. And so it's beaten with very fine blades for a specified number of hours after it's been, put through other processes that are called cooking, that require a certain kind of fermentation. A sheet of paper traditionally is made by, and this is European paper making for the most part, originating, with this kind of technology, originated this particular technology, used wood frames with screens on them. And the paper they're called molds and decals. I'm going to stay away from real deep technical talk because I don't really understand it well enough to speak for it. And I'm sure I've already, made some mistakes. And that paper is then, you can see here a demonstration of a small piece. This is Amy Jacobs, one of the master paper makers and collaborators at Dieu Donné right now. That paper is then put onto a felt. Well, it's called a pellon, but it's kind of like a felt, and allowed to drain. And you can see how big these can get at the paper mill. You can also see that they can be pigmented, both in the vat, as in here, and on the surface, as you can see in the little bottles. Now, another picture of such. And here you can see that at the mill, the master paper makers often help very directly in facilitating the artist's vision by guiding them technically. And in these other things here, whoops, you can see that these sheets are so big and so heavy because they're full of water that they require more than one person to move anyway. They're pressed in hydraulic presses under, many thousands of pounds of pressure, and then put into drying systems. So this is a description of, the paper, the way paper is made at the mill, and it's also largely a description of how Western paper, has been made in one form or another for some centuries. Now, paper is a writing surface. We think of it as a writing surface or an art making surface, but there were writing surfaces well before there was paper as we understand it today. Papyrus, for instance, is not paper as we understand it today, because it's not beaten, and it doesn't depend on the interaction of fibers that bind together. Vellum also, which is lamb skin, is not paper as we understand it today. Both of them were used for paper. Some of the earliest paper, I believe, was made with mulberry, from the mulberry tree. And so most paper is cellulose-based material, not animal or protein-based. And what is so interesting about that to me was that that ties it very closely to textile. With the exception of wool and silk, textiles also are, by and large, when they're made of natural materials, even if they're synthetically compounded, made with cellulose-based materials. So it happens that in 2008, for the first time, I started actually learning about the history of textile production, really from the point of view of labor and industry and technology within the United States, the relationships between North and South, between organized labor and, you know, slavery, and therefore by extension sort of leading me into a more global study of colonialism and industry. When I started working with paper, it became clear immediately how strong the parallels were with paper, between paper and textile. And very often paper is made from recycled textiles. So linen, which has already been processed in so many ways from its existence as a plant, in order to make a textile, is then further processed to become paper. And the paper we use that's made from trees really only became prevalent when the demand for paper, you know, because of so much publishing, you know, outstripped the availability of cotton and linen to produce it. At the paper mill, we have access primarily to cotton, linen, and flax, and abaca, which is made from some part of the banana plant. You can, so in 2008, when I was a resident, you know, my learning curve was very steep. It took me pretty much the entire residency to get anywhere in terms of having a focus and having a relationship to the material. That's the way I work. By the very end of my residency, I started to use the grid as a way to relate the weave of the textile to the pulp, and as a way of fusing these materials together. What you see here is a pretty large piece, about, I think it's like 30 by 40 inches. And it's got a base layer of thick cotton casting pulp on which layers of cut fabric that have been saturated with methyl cellulose, wet and soaked in methyl cellulose, which is an adhesive, a very kind of light, also cellulose-based adhesive that's used in paper making and book making, under, you know, many thousands of pounds of pressure. So I became really interested in the idea that the grid structure, having trouble moving my slides. Oh, okay. I don't know why this is happening. That the grid structure would allow me to sort of combine these references and also use the paper to sandwich my textile elements and that the way in which they would fuse the paper on top and the paper underneath fuses would help to create a structural system that could support what I wanted to do. So you can see this big piece of recycled textile, which is a packing blanket, you know, is sandwiched between two black paper grids. I made a series of these where I was layering grids of fabric between grids of paper. And as they passed through the openings, the paper sealed the fabric between it. I really like that compression that the process brings to the work. Pigmentation is interesting in paper because when you pigment cotton, it will always fade. If you pigment linen, it holds the color much more powerfully. So this is a piece from 2015 as opposed to the others from 2013 on a larger scale, where I'm literally weaving in the process layers of strips of fabric with strips of paper, and then applying, I think, a black linen pulp to the surface, which you can see is very dark and retains the darkness. So painting with pulp is another option. And here you can also see like a brilliant linen green over a translucent white abaca with layers of fabric. I moved on from this stage to constructing other kinds of matrices. And so this was where, you know, again, I think of these in terms of being relationships between surface and substrate, where you don't really have one or the other, where everything is everything, where each element is both autonomous and completely dependent on the overall structure. So I would cut wedges of fabric and wedges of paper and then interleave them to create a structure that barely held itself together. These are 11 by 14. They're different modules because of the molds are standardized. And so these were made in 2012. So what I'm doing is I'm showing you a series of examples of different matrices, essentially, that enable the work to take on a structure and that inflect its appearance, you know, very dramatically. So in 2013, I started playing around with the hose, because in the studio, you know, the hose is a big part of what we do, what we use. We use it to clean. We use it to agitate. But I started pulling sheets of pulp and then using the pressure of the hose, and it is under a lot of pressure, which you can adjust. You can adjust the thickness of the stream of water to essentially draw into the surface of the pulp that was on the mold. And so what the pressure does is it just creates spaces in that pulp, openings, which then when laid down on one another or on textiles, which are the source of, you know, the pink here and the dark red and the deep yellow here. You know, you can see one thing through the other. And then you can also see that there are holes here. So the idea was to kind of create something that would hold together, but just barely, through a process of layering. Now here, a similar thing is happening, except that there is a solid substrate under it. So I made some of each of these different colors of brilliantly pigmented linen on top of a cotton base with layers of fabric in between the layers of pulp, and then on the surface as well. And, you know, in a place like this, I would have been just squeezing pulp out of a bottle. But you can see that that brilliant color, you know, is retained by the linen, whereas this would probably have been considerably brighter when this yellow, when it was put down. So that's something you kind of have to get to know a bit. Here, another one that is kind of barely holding together. You can see the spaces going through it. So it's kind of a painting where I have a certain amount of control over the tools and implements that I'm using. I mean, I have ultimate control to edit, to continue to layer, but I'm giving up some control as well because the force of this water is stronger than I am sometimes. So then moving on from there, and about at the same time, I started playing around with rolling the pulp under my hand. So I would pull a big sheet of paper, and then I would just take my hand and run it along the surface. And I don't know if this is clear at all, but you know, the pulp would start to bead up and roll under my fingers. And what you're seeing here, I think, is maybe 1 or 2 base layers of gray and blue pulp with purpley pink pulp that's been rolled, put onto the top of it, you know, interspersed with pigmented textiles. Something up here would have been a textile probably that I had dipped into pulp and then wrung out so that it, you know, had some pulp on it. Here's one where this thing had to get into a frame fast in order to just survive. It's so fragile. And of course, I love to have things visible out of a frame because the materiality of the surface is so much more available and is so important to me. But I was really, you know, seduced by creating something this vulnerable, and where, you know, here, basically the rolls are just hanging out in the air. So you can see that, you know, the pigmentation is capable of like tremendous subtlety as well as, you know, stark contrast. And the edge, you know, this all somewhat defies or, you know, flies in the face of any of the, you know, rules for how you're supposed to make paper. And the great paper makers, you know, pride themselves in being able to make perfect sheets of paper. This has never been really an option for me, and not a goal either. But I, you know, I feel very privileged to be able to say that. Here's a piece that is there is fabric in it, but it just sort of little scraps of it mixed into the pulp, but there's no layering of fabric. There's simply layering of pulp that's been dragged. So you can see space behind it. With this one, I mounted it slightly offset from the surface so that it would even have a bit of shadow in there. And then this final group took place when I started to to use rubber mats, the kind that you would find in a car, on the floor in a car, to emboss the pulp. And here I do have some process shots to show you so that you can get an idea of how these were made. So what I would have done here is to first, cut all of these things into strips, these plastic or rubber floor mats, pulled a big sheet of white casting pulp, because casting pulp shows the impression. It's very thick and fluffy. And then when it's pressed, it will give the deepest impression. I put down little strips of fabric on it. You can see them kind of along the edges. I put down the rubber, and then what you don't see here is that I would have then poured pigmented pulp like this, black, and then also white. So this is like a white pigmented pulp, which looks quite distinct from the white of the base sheet. And I think there's some other pulp in here too. There's some green pulp put on underneath the rubber, several colors of pulp. So in the final piece, what you see is that the rubber acts as a resist, and the pulp, the pigmented pulp, seeps in between the cracks. And that when you take this off, what's left is, you see what was there underneath it, and you see the pulp that's been poured in between the seams. But you also see all of this cool, whoops, okay, so that's this one. Here you see the brilliant linen yellow pulp poured around the molds, the rubber. And I thought I had a detail of that. But yeah, you can see the impressions that the patterns on the rubber that are being made in there. So, there's a kind of a competing impressions, competing patterns between the patterns in the fabric, the shapes of the rubber, and the patterns in the surface. So just to sort of step back, I took this one mat, and I cut it into strips. And I even numbered these strips so that they would stay in order. And then I made a series of pieces using this one set. So I think of them as, a kind of a variable addition almost. At least that was my idea. And what would have happened here would have been, there would have been a base layer of pulp laid down, then a series of strips of fabric put on top of it, and possibly some other colors of pulp and paper, other things. And then a top layer put on top of then the rubber would have been put down, and then another layer of pulp would have been put on top of it, and then peeled away so that the rubber was exposed in the wet state. Then the whole thing would have been pressed. And what you see here on the right is a dried thing of paper combined with fabric with this rubber on top that has already been pressed and come out of the drying system. Then I would have peeled the rubber off as carefully as I can, but you can see that it still tears a lot. And so it kind of creates this window between the top layer and the under layer, into which, this compression, in which the compression takes place. So you get the pattern of the dots and the compression of both the fabric and the pulp, with a little sort of louvered screen over the top of it. So this one is fairly straightforward. After that, I went on to make quite a few others. And I'm showing a couple of them here. So this one, has got lots of green and yellow pulp, both underneath and above, green and yellow fabric, multiple colored fabrics, bright colored yellow linen pulp on top. but it's the same format. You know, I intentionally lined up the rubber in the same way in hopes of creating something that so the pieces would relate to one another and sort of be generated by the same underlying kind of what I'll call loosely a matrix. And then this one, now see how kind of dark beige that is here. See, compare the colors. This is in the wet stage. So this is before this has been pressed. You can kind of almost see like wet surface of this blackish pulp on there. So, and then this is it after everything's been taken off. See how the white color has faded in the drawing, and even what seemed to be black is now like a sort of a charcoal blue gray. And the structure is a lot less rigidly drawn, but it's still, at least to my eye, you know, references that. This is probably the most dimensional of a piece that I've done like this. It was 30 by 40 inches. And I dried it, I air dried it rather than putting it into the drying system at the mill. So it was pressed. Then I took it with me and air dried it so that it warped. And it warped quite a bit. I don't have good pictures of the warp. You can kind of see the way these layers separated. But the whole piece is actually warped and very dimensional. This is a series, just a group of these to end with, less sort of systematically constructed than, for instance, the one you saw before, but where, as you can see, the rubber inserts, the rubber embossing acts both as a resist, keeping color out of that area, and as a surface embossment. This piece has white linen pulp on top of white cotton pulp. So you get this pretty subtle shift. So these all do have pretty straightforward substrates supporting them, big, thick cotton sheets with layers of fabric on top of them. Fusing, you know, the compression under the embossed compression sort of fuses the fabric on there too. This ends in, I think 2017, so it kind of represents, you know, a period roughly between 2010 and 2017. And since that time, I haven't really had the chance to work so much with paper, but it was a wonderful experience, and putting this together makes me want to do more. So thank you. I hope that didn't take too long. Oh, looks good.
Thank you so much, Elana, for that fascinating look into your work and process. It's been something I know myself has been incredibly curious about. We've been talking about kind of the intellectual aspects of paper, and now in our reading group, we're moving forward to talking about kind of the sensory aspects to these processes. So this has been great to stir up our thinking in that regard. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Elise. I'm the postdoctoral researcher with Artifact Lab. And I'm going to moderate a bit of a discussion here with Elana. We had so many questions, so many of them inspired by your process and how you go about making the pieces. And I believe some of them actually were answered as we went further into your talk. I'm just going to consolidate some of them, and if anybody has any questions they would like to pose to Elana directly, they can raise their hand and we can unmute you, but I'll start with some of the typed ones. First of all, this notion of fragility came up and somebody asked for you to talk a little bit more about how much this aspect of fragility is component to your work. So I just was curious if you could expand on that a little bit.
That's such an interesting question. Fragility is actually not something that, it's not a word that I think about that much. And I think I used it specifically in relationship to that one piece, that one specific piece when I was talking just now. I would say overall, I would tend to use the word precariousness to describe an aspect of my work that I aspire to more often, either precariousness or apparent precariousness, a sense that what I make is unstable or held together by threads, you might say, or by things that are not really clear, where the structural systems are not clear or appear to be precarious.
I just can't help but jump in with my own question. I'm going to take advantage of being moderator here, but I'm talking about stability. I was particularly curious about this tension between textile and paper, and when paper becomes a textile or the textile becomes paper, and the slipperiness between those two forms. And I was wondering if that was something you were conscious of when going into the residency, or if it was happenstance kind of commonality in the way these things are weaved together as the substrate for your work.
Well, that makes me want to say a couple of different things. It reminds me that one of the things I had meant to say at the very, very beginning, and then completely forgot about, was that paper pulp is a very strange thing to work with. It's not a plastic material. It's not like other sculptural materials like clay. It's not like what it looks like it might be. You can't really model it. You can't really control it. Somebody I know once described it as resembling oatmeal, but oatmeal is too easy. Oatmeal would be easier to work with. Oatmeal is glutinous. It's not glutinous. It has no structural integrity until it's been subjected to a process of fiber alignment, that takes place when you're shaking it in the mold, and that has something to do with like magnetic ionization, and then it gets put through the press and it solidifies. It's a lot more like felt in some ways than like a woven structure. It doesn't have that. So I think whatever obvious connections there were physically to textile were completely undermined by the actual experience of trying to work with the stuff. And also I do have background in clay, so I, kind of am used to that tactility. But having said that, I guess my interest in interrogating, or whatever you want to call it, the structure of textile, for instance, in my stapled work, the wall work or the panel work, which is kind of preoccupied with this idea of breaking down that structure, but also kind of mimicking it in the stapled work and understanding it as a kind of system, of a gridded system, where many, many, many elements contribute to the whole, you know, to making the whole, giving the whole any integrity at all. Okay, so there's a kind of analogy between that structure and the paper structure, although it is so different. And I think I found it very satisfying to kind of try to approach both of those structures and to integrate them into one another. You know, the idea that the paper could bond between the whole, bond through the holes that I was cutting in the fabric, could bond to itself. It never fully bonds to the fabric. They repel one another to some extent, especially if you're not using cotton. I just found those things fascinating on a very visceral level. I don't know if that answers.
I am absolutely. I'm going to go to one of the questions posed in the chat from a fellow paperologist and a fellow paper artist themselves, but Mike Sweeney wants to know, is your intent with paper to present primarily a more direct material process and sensory experience, or is there something in the subject or content that you want to reference for viewers, like the hanging sheets did? So thank you so much for that question, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mike. And good to see you on the screen. I would say that my experience in working with paper is one of sheer delight, you know, visual pleasure, immediacy, compared to so much of the work I do, which is very laborious and time consuming and repetitive. The immediacy of the work is, you know, beyond description in terms of pleasure. So that, and I would have to say that concept and history aside, I mean, that is the ultimate driving force in everything I do, whether it's, you know, whether there's something I can talk about that goes beyond that or not. So, but as far as sort of interrogating its structure, that does bring me back in, always brings me back into a formal conversation about really, literally, you know, these relationships between surface and structure and surface and substrate, that take me back to, you know, the whole history of my existence as a visual artist, kind of trying to come to terms with my inheritance and my, you know, upbringing, and to be inventive.
Thank you so much for that. We have many questions about process, but I'm almost curious to go through some of the more conceptual ones, just because you yourself kind of hinted towards the idea that this isn't about a mastery of paper making per se, but of utilizing it as part of your greater art practice. So I'm not sure, maybe I'll throw out some of the process questions for you, but feel free to pass if you don't want to answer them. So one of the questions was about the stickiness, but actually I believe we talked about that. So perhaps this one from Meredith. Could you talk a little bit more about the residency itself and how it affected your process? And if there is another material that you would like to incorporate into your work?
Good question. Okay, the residency did affect my process. And although I did not show you any pictures of work I've done with carpet, floor pieces that I've done with carpet, it's most obvious in those pieces. So I'm going to have to kind of leave that a little bit unfulfilled as far as, you know, answering. But the layering and the idea of working, of sort of excavating from one layer to another, that I evolved during the residency, toward the end of the residency, and that brought me very directly in confrontation with the grid, which I think of as a kind of a sort of icon of modernism, and you know, a building block that underlies, you know, every aspect of urban life, and as well as textile production. And that kind of fusing of those motifs almost did go very directly into a large body of work that I've done, layering carpets on the floor, which you can find some of on my website, actually, most of on my website. The residency itself, okay, the residency itself, another thing it did was it really connected me to color more explicitly, more directly than I was in my previous work, because I'd been working with a lot of monochromatic textiles before that, and also, you know, with, you know, really without a clear sense of direction as far as color goes. So in that way, I guess it brought me more in touch with a kind of pictorial world and a painting world, I guess. I'm not sure. It humbled me. The residency humbled me because it was so frustrating and I had so many failures. And it also, one of the limitations of the residency is that on the upside, you know, you have a facilitator there and a collaborator, but on the downside, it's not a private process in that way. And it wasn't until I finished my residency and started going back by myself on my own and working on a smaller scale that I could manipulate all the material alone. That's when I started to have a much more intimate relationship, and my rather intuitive process was able to flourish rather than, you know, feel constrained by having to sort of make art in committee, you know. And I wasn't as self-conscious too. I think that helped. Hope that answers those.
I think, unfortunately, we have to conclude with one more question, and one that stands out as a good way to wrap things up was one about how this work is presented and stored.
Well, the storage part is pretty easy compared to, you know, storing my other work. You know, you can get nice acid-free boxes and layer everything between sheets of, you know, acid-free material. And by the way, you know, the pulp is, because it's an artist's mill and it's not wood pulp, you know, it's all stabilized and that kind of thing. So storage is not an issue with the paperwork, except when it's warped and dimensional, which is why, you know, I've only made a few. I showed you one where I said, you know, it got air dried and it's warped. So that kind of has its own box. And, you know, there aren't that many, there's just not that much room for that in my life. So unfortunately, you know, I don't think the conservation of the paper pieces is that big an issue.
What about presentation?
Oh, presentation, I forgot that part. Well, once again, I love the materiality of the pieces. And one of the things that really drew me to making more of them that did have very solid substrates, like I showed at the end, was their sturdiness and the fact that they can be hinged and then mounted to the wall without being protected by a frame. Now, somebody who owns one of those, I guess, might want it framed anyway, just to protect it from dust or from cats. So I just defer to others on that.
Fair enough.
It's just my, this is my crossed bear with all of my work, you know, because it's so, it's, you know, it's meant to be visceral and immediate, and there are limits to that in the real world, to how, you know, that plays in the real world. So.
Absolutely. And I mean, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. We couldn't get to all of the questions, but that aspect of being tactile and the layers was something that came up quite a bit in the chat. So what I think we'll do is say thank you again to Elana, and I will post the link to her website in the chat so we can spend some more time with these amazing pieces. I want to remind everybody as well that we have an event coming up, which will perhaps answer some questions about papermaking process that we didn't get to here. That is on February 8th with Retaille Atelier. And this is recorded, so we will circulate it. And perhaps if you wouldn't mind, Elana, I can pose some of the questions to you in typed form and we can circulate.
And if you can save the chat, that would be great.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because I have not been able to look at it at all, you can assume. So.
Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. And I will post again the website for Artifact Lab so you can keep track of everything we're doing with Paperology as well. If you're interested in participating, you can find more information there. So thank you everybody for joining us.
And thank you all. Great to see everybody.
Thank you.
See you next week. Yeah.